Welcome to the 5th devlog for Gullywasher. I'm the Dev Foster Turtle. Gullywasher is a story-driven Metroidvania centered around a sparrow named Finch and her quest to uncover the secrets of her new home, the rain-soaked forest floors of Arava. Since the last devlog, I've started on some concept art for our cast of characters, worked on implementing the first enemy, and started building out a currency system. I believe that your creativity and output is heavily influenced by the media that you consume. Gullywasher never would have gotten off the ground had I not fallen in love with games like Hollow Knight and Breath of the Wild. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been spending a lot of my free time reading graphic novels, which has put me in the mood to work on art for Gullywasher. I'm not going to give away how any of the characters fit into the story, but if you want to keep their designs a surprise and discover them organically, feel free to skip ahead to the timestamp shown on screen where I go over implementing the first enemy. Discussing motivated character design without giving away pieces of the story is a delicate task, so I'm going to talk about character design in a more general sense. My hope is that each of the designs speak for themselves. As Finch approaches each of the characters, the player will form assumptions about them. In character design, you can communicate things through your design decisions to help players draw correct assumptions or subvert player expectations over time. Anytime I am writing a new character for any kind of story, I always start by deciding on 2 adjectives that I feel describe the character best. All of their future actions and decisions are governed by the 2 adjectives I've settled on, and help guide me while trying to discern how a character would behave. I'm not claiming this is the best method. It doesn't fit complex character writing, but the 2 adjectives method fits my style of simple storytelling just right. I find deciding on these adjectives super helpful as I approach character designs as well. You can reflect the core personality traits of your characters through the shared design language we've built through years of media. I find cartoons to be a really good example of this. If you want to communicate that a character is kind and helpful, it will lead to different design decisions than a character that is disgruntled and disillusioned. You'll notice that even though these characters are from very different stories, the design language is consistent. Rounded, softer edges are more inviting and friendly, and sharper, sterner shapes are more prickly to approach. This plays into the shape language that we talked about in the very first devlog. Using strong silhouettes for characters works in the same way as using strong silhouettes in your other designs. The characters that I've been working on in the background are not final designs, but rather a first pass on what I want them to look like. Some of them have stronger designs than others, and are closer to their final look. Doing a first pass on these characters early will help me as I continue to flesh out the story. Now I will have a mental picture to match with the adjectives I mentioned earlier, giving me a more complete picture of the characters and how they play into the story. Approaching character in this way is similar to my approach to game design. In game design, I like to build my mechanics and art together and let those decisions play into each other. By writing and drawing characters simultaneously, each will influence the other and lead to a more cohesive final product. As an aside, I'm having trouble naming the bow-tie-toting bat, so let me know in the comments if you have a name that you think would fit. Feel free to drop suggestions for other characters in there too, if there's a name that really resonates with you. Next, we're going to start work on our first enemy. As I said at the beginning of the devlog, I've been in an art kind of mood lately, so that's where I started with the enemy too. As I approach this first enemy, I can lean into the design language that we've built with the gumball plants to identify them as a danger. While this may seem like an obvious decision, intentionally making these connections will allow the player to draw fast conclusions subconsciously because of their previous experience with games. To draw these connections, I leaned into 2 design choices. The enemy should be spiky, and we can use the same colors that we used in the plant. The final thing we can do to really sell this concept to the player is have the enemy reflect something generally considered dangerous in real life. To do this, I tried to emulate centipedes with my approach to the design. As it turns out, implementing the enemy into the game turned out to be, well, a bit buggy. The small centis, as I affectionately nicknamed them in my file names, making me way too attached to these little guys, well, they moonwalked. And they took knockback while not being hit, and took knockback in the wrong direction, and they juggled Finch like a bean-filled hacky sack, and completely broke my fledgling currency system. On the upside, it looks like getting rich quick in Arava won't be a problem as you start your adventure. Debugging my buggy little bug friends was by far the biggest task of development up to this point. Every step forward I made, I took 2 steps back with the problems that I caused. Welcome to the absolutely wonderful brain teaser world of game development. This is genuinely one of my favorite things about being a dev. Yes, it's extremely frustrating at points, and yes, it's more time consuming than you ever expect it to be. But thinking through a problem from start to finish and seeing it finally work the way that you expect it is one of the absolute best parts about game development. Don't worry though, I'm sure there will still be plenty of bugs to discover once the game is finally at a state for playtesting. After all of that work on our very first enemy in the game, we're going to give it low health and watch as Finch takes it out in 2 hits. The first enemy is crucial as it will set player expectations on how to interact with all future enemies. We need to set the barrier to entry low so that new players can get a feel for the world without having to worry too much about the threat of this first enemy. The player can experiment with what works and what doesn't against it, but ultimately the basic conclusions they draw should be consistent across all enemies. To clarify, enemies may have different behaviors. They might bounce around their environment in different ways, or attack Finch with different movesets, but after fighting the first enemy, the player should know how to approach them. So why go through all this trouble if the small senti is going to perish on the second hit? The reason to me is simple. The more intuitive your game is, the more fluid the player experience will be. If the things in your game make sense without the player having to furrow their brow and think through the logic, your game will be a far more pleasant experience. It's following through on the idea that if Finch gets knocked back when she hits an enemy, then the enemy should also get knocked back when they get hit. There are no physics built into Gullywasher, but if we don't emulate player expectations to a certain extent, then it will lead to a frustrating player experience. The last thing worked into Gullywasher this devlog was the currency system. This turned out to be a surprisingly easy thing to implement, which means it will likely be just as easy for y'all to break. The currency system operates off of one global variable, which tracks the total currency a player has collected. I would like Gullywasher to be a more casual gaming experience than some of the games that inspired it, so I'd like to limit the stress of losing all your money through missteps. Instead, when you rest under an awning or umbrella, your total money will be updated, but if you die before you rest, you will only lose the money that you've collected since you last rested. Hopefully, this will lead to fewer nail-bitingly dangerous situations for players, but still keep the gameplay interesting. Lastly, we need to provide feedback to the player to let them know what is happening when they pick up a shell, which I'm using as currency for the game. I'd still like to keep the on-screen UI as simple as possible, so when the player picks up a shell, the UI feedback will only pop up on the screen momentarily. We will display the total shells consistently in the pause screen so that the player can still access the information anytime that they want. Finally, we'll add in some sound to really drive the point home. Thank you so much for sticking around as we start to expand the world. Your feedback is heard, and it means the world to me that you've taken the time to listen to me ramble about one of my favorite hobbies. If there's something that you'd like me to break down in more detail, or just something that you're curious about, feel free to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. As always, stay positive, keep creating, and share your gifts with the world.